With more than 100 years of experience, Mitas is one of Europe's leading motorcycle tyre brands. Whether you ride on the trails, enduro, on the road or on adventures, Mitas have the tyres for you. If they're good enough for the likes of Chris Birch and Paul Tarris, they're good enough for me and our Noel. For more information, go to mitas-moto.com. Go the distance with Mitas tyres. Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. In October 1967, Mary Sievier set off from Sussex in England to ride to India on a motorcycle. She reached India and kept going all the way round the world for 9 years, making her the first British woman to circumnavigate the globe alone on a motorbike. In November 2021, she sat down with filmmaker Martin Moore to tell her story. Before we get into it, let me just give you a little bit more information about this episode. This episode tells the story of the remarkable Mary Sievier, also known as Mary Motorcycle. The idea for this podcast came from Sol Jevons, who worked with Martin Moore to help tell the story of Mary's travels after Mary was located and contacted by Tiffany Coates after 50 years of Mary completing her travels. So we're delighted to welcome not only Saul, Martin and Tiffany to this episode, but also Patrick Collins, who is a curator of the National Motor Museum in Bewley, where Mary's motorcycle is now on display. This seemed like a fantastic opportunity to get a better understanding of Mary's story with the four people that have played a very big part in getting the story out to the wider public. You can watch the full film on Vimeo. Just search for Mary Motorcycle Vimeo. And if you want more information, there are 8 excellent episodes of the podcast that Martin recorded and made available on all good podcasting platforms, and I highly recommend you do watch and listen to all of those episodes because it is a really remarkable story. I do hope you enjoy this episode. I've put an awful lot of effort into it, both in research, recording and editing with the four guys. And it's a different format to usual. It isn't just a straightforward interview. We've actually used Martin's audio and interspersed lots of clips with Mary to help you get a full taste and the full flavour of what she was like and what she achieved back in the 60s and the 70s. Right, let's get on with it.
My name's Martin Moore. I was the editor of Bike Magazine in the early 90s. More recently, I've been making short documentary films. In 2021, I was approached by Sol Jevons, one of the organisers of the Overland event, to go and interview an old lady, Mary Sievier, who in her 20s rode round the world on a BSA Bantam.
Also known as Mary Motorcycle.
Yeah, that was the name that the Australian press gave her because they couldn't get to grips with the spelling of Sievier, so they just called her Mary Motorcycle.
You made a film and also a series of podcasts.
Yeah, the original idea that Saul had was that we would film Mary talking about her journey and then break up the interview into sort of 20-minute, half-hour episodes. He was working on the idea of a streaming TV channel at the time, and the idea was we would put it out on this TV channel in half-hour episodes. That didn't get off the ground because it's a bit harder to launch a TV channel than we all thought it would be. And so we decided to put the whole interview together as a film, interspersing it with photographs that she took on her journey, and that became the Mary Motorcycle film.
Let's hear from Saul as he explains where the idea came from.
I'm Saul. I'm, along with Paddy Tyson, I'm one half of the, I use the term loosely, organising team for the Overland event. I've known Martin for about 25 years or so, kind of on and off, but we originally met because he was editor of a magazine called Fleet News, which interacted with my day job of road safety. Martin and I got to know each other, got on very well. And then about 20 years later, suddenly discovered that we're both into motorbikes. When the idea came to me of having this kind of subscription club and doing interviews with prominent overlanders. The idea was, well, I'll chat Martin up and he'll do the first one for nothing as a bit of an experiment, and I'll promise him that, some money will come along in the end, And so I promised him a bacon sandwich for the first one. So he drove from Peterborough down to Gosport, spent the day with Mary, did the film, and then spent weeks on end editing it. He likes to remind me that all he's ever got out of it is a bacon sandwich.
A name that's probably quite familiar with most of our listeners is the legendary Tiffany Coates.
Motorbike traveller for many years, crossed every continent, some of them 2 or 3 times. I also work as a freelance motorbike tour guide as well, specialising in Asia, Africa and Latin America. My connection with Mary, well, like quite a lot of things these days, it came about because of Facebook. The British rider Linda Bick, who was a phenomenal rider and still is, from the 70s, 80s, 90s. She's just turned 80 herself. 5 years ago, posted up something on Facebook, and it was a newspaper clipping from Australia from 1971, I think. And she said, "I've always wondered about this woman. Can anyone help me track her down?" And I read through the article, and it was basically Mary's story. And it said, Motorcycle Mary has ridden her motorbike from the UK to Australia, and now she's going to ride around Australia. Struth, the Sheila's crazy, seemed to be the main gist of it. That route that goes all the way around the country, a lot of it was unpaved. Not only is it extremely remote, but it's unpaved dirt roads with fuel and food very sparse along the route. So the Aussies were just much more taken up with, never mind she's ridden all the way here, but she's never going to get round Australia. Linda said, over the years, I've always wondered, did Mary make it all the way around Australia? Did she make it home to the UK again? Is she even still alive? This newspaper article was 50 years old, and it was good old newspaper clipping in black and white with a great photo of Mary. Linda put it up on Facebook. A lot of us shared it. We thought, with the power of the internet, there must be someone who can track her down. And sure enough, someone I know tracked her down and said, right, this is the woman. The situation hadn't been helped by the fact that the Aussies had actually spelt Mary's surname incorrectly. And also, Mary, at one point during her journeys, married Mr. Smith. So went from being Mary Sievier to being Mary Smith, which apparently there were thousands and thousands of Mary Smiths of that generation. It was a tricky task. Hopefully through your programme, we might get a reminder of who it was. I was passed on, it's this woman on Facebook. Shona Ravensdale and Pat Thompson are 2 very well-travelled women. They call themselves the Dusty Old Bags, and they live close to Portsmouth, where Mary lives. So I said, there's this woman, Mary. We've tracked her down. You're close to her. Do you want to make the call? Shona rang her up, was chatting and said, oh, well, there's Tiffany would like to speak with you. So Mary said, yep, tell her to phone me up. Now, as all of you will know who have spoken to Mary, and I'm looking at these faces smiling back at me, that first conversation with Mary was an hour and a half on the phone. We were both talking. It's never just a monologue with Mary. She's got a lot to say, but she's a very good listener as well. It was just her story came flooding out. Over 50 years, this was the first time that she'd ever talked to another round-the-world biker, let alone another woman round-the-world rider. We had so many similar experiences, shared adventures in various countries, sort of, oh my goodness, really? Oh my goodness. I came away from that conversation just absolutely exhilarated, thinking her recall of it was just crystal clear, absolutely amazing. And I said, Mary, you need to come to the Overland event. I'm going to make a couple of phone calls for you.
What is remarkable there, I guess, is that she was unaware of this whole subculture of adventure motorcycling and adventure motorcyclists that she was one of the very early pioneers of.
I'm Patrick Collins, and my day job is curator of vehicles and research at the National Motor Museum at Bewley in the New Forest in Hampshire. We received an email at the museum from her, which was passed to me, and basically she introduced herself and said, "Oh, I've got a 1965 BSA Bantam. I wonder if you'd like to have it on display in the museum." As an aside, dropped it. Oh, by the way, I rode it round the world between 67 and 76. And after the 2022 Overland, Paddy Tyson delivered the bike to us after the event. And then a couple of weeks later, Mary visited with members of her family. And from that day on, I'm very happy to have regular phone calls and lengthy email correspondence from her, really for the remainder of her days.
Patrick, you might find that you get the same from me, actually, because I love motor museums. There's a great one near me up in Cumbria, which I must have been to about 6 times. And there is a wealth of small motor museums in the UK, farmers' barns and things like that, where you pay a couple of quid for. I love every single one of them. Martin and Saul, Mary set off in 1967. Bearing in mind that was 7 years before Ted Simon set off on his travels. Just how remarkable was that at the time?
I don't think Mary thought it was such a big deal when she originally set off to ride to India. She struck me as one of these people who kind of got a bit of a bee in her bonnet and decided she was going to do something, and she was going to show those bloody reds, and she was going to ride to India on a motorbike. She was a very forceful character, a very strong woman. She decided that if she put her mind to this journey, there was nothing in the world was going to stop her doing it. And I look back on it now and think that was just incredible. And it was an amazingly brave and courageous thing. But I don't think Mary felt that way. I think she kind of took the whole world in her stride, really, did Mary. And that was the feeling I was left with when I spoke to her.
The comment you made about the bloody Reds is she initially decided she was going to ride to Russia, but couldn't get a visa to get into Russia. So she went, I'll go to India instead and show them.
There were female motorcyclists. There were female motorcyclists who'd done extraordinary things, but they were few and far between. And there weren't a huge number of men who were doing things like that at the time. Mary didn't regard herself as a feminist, but at the same time, she saw absolutely no reason whatsoever why she couldn't do anything that a man could do. It was highly unusual to have anyone doing it, and it was even more highly unusual to have a female doing it. In subsequent decades, it was still rare, but at the time, it was, I think it was something quite extraordinary. But as Martin said, Mary didn't see it as extraordinary at all. It was just something that she decided to do.
What struck me as remarkable is that she decided that a motorcycle was the only possible way she could do this journey, but she'd never actually ridden a motorcycle before. She picked up the BSA. How did she get it home? Because she couldn't actually ride it at that point, could she?
She was working in the magistrates' court in Chichester and used to talk to these police motorcycle mechanics over lunch. They said, oh yes, if you're going to do that, you want to do it on a Bantam. And they said this with great authority, neither of them having done a big overland trip themselves. They said, it's easy to maintain, it's small, it's light, you'll be able to pick it up on your own. You and one other person will be able to put it in a van or a pickup if you break down and you can't fix it. So that's what they'd recommended. So she found this second-hand machine, went and bought it, but had never ridden a motorcycle and didn't know what to do with it. So she told me, it's not in the podcast, but it's something she just told me on the phone one day. She'd gone to pick it up. They'd sort of showed her in a fairly rudimentary way how it worked, had set her off from the dealership to go home, which I think was something like a sort of 20-minute journey. And it took something like an hour because she didn't really understand how the clutch worked. And so every time she came to somewhere where she had to stop, a junction, a set of traffic lights, whatever, she just braked and the bike would stall and she didn't know how to start it again. So she'd have to wait for a passerby to come and help her start the bike and set her off again. And then she'd kind of continue until she got to the next place where she had to stop and would then put the brakes on and the bike would stall and she'd have to wait for a passerby again. She did then go on to do one of the RAC ACU courses. To go from that to spending 9 years riding around the world is pretty impressive.
Tell us a little bit more about Mary. Who was she? What's her background and kind of what did she do for a living up until then? She was only 26 at this point, wasn't she?
Mary came from quite an unconventional family. Her dad was a notorious gambler, and Mary took after him in that respect and was very proud of all her gambling. It sounds like they were quite an eccentric family. Various family members went off to different parts of the world. She was just following the rest of the family footsteps, really, striking out, doing her own thing. She trained in sort of secretarial skills, had worked her way up into being, was it like a court secretary, that kind of thing. At the time of her journey was working in the magistrates' courts. I think that gave her a really good insight into human nature and what people can be like. She'd seen a lot of life by that point. even though some people would say, she was still so young, but she'd also undertaken a lot of other travels previous to the motorbike trip, like hitchhiking all over Europe, going out to Libya and things like that. So certainly struck out on her own doing things.
She talked quite a bit about her hitchhiking in the podcast, didn't she, Martin? She said that was the thing that kind of gave her the confidence to set off, knowing that she could cope with whatever the road was going to throw at her, I suppose. Let's let Mary fill in the details.
When I had holidays, I had done quite a lot of hitchhiking. And even at weekends, I used to go out of Chichester, usually get into large trucks. And sometimes they would go from Chichester round the North Circular Road to get to the north of London. And my sister, very conveniently, had a house on the North Circular Road. And it got to the stage where she would say, "Darling, do you mind awfully, when they're dropping you off, could you possibly do it further up the road because the neighbours are beginning to talk?" And it would be Boots and I don't know what other large container trucks. But because I had done a lot of hitchhiking, I think this certainly must have built up a lot of confidence in what I actually ended up doing.
She had a confidence. I think that stood her in good stead throughout the motorcycle trip. She was also fortunate enough to have contacts in some of the places that she went to. And I think it's part of I don't know whether it's the old empire or the British colonies, that she was able to travel around the world with that kind of confidence of an English woman of that time, perhaps. That maybe opened a few doors to her and allowed her to take advantage of a few connections on the journey as well.
She was actually fairly strong-willed. Her mum tried to stop her from leaving, and she came up with rather a cunning scheme so that she could actually continue to travel on her motorcycle.
When my mother found out that I was going to go to India on the motorbike, she said, "Oh, no, you're not." And I said, "Oh, yes, I am." And she said, "No, you are not." And I said, "In that case, I will sell the bike. I will blame you because I will lose money on it. And I shall hitchhike to India instead." And she said, "Oh, right." And she picked up a cloth and she said, "Now then, darling, which part of the motorbike shall I polish? Because yes, you're going to be better off going on a motorbike than hitchhiking. You will at least be independent, even if you don't know how to ride the bloody thing."
Saul Jevons tells us a little bit more about the catalyst that set Mary off on her travels.
There was a travel competition in the Daily Telegraph, I think it was. They were sort of giving prizes for people doing interesting things. And so, that was the point at which she thought, I'll ride to Russia. They'd sort of just started opening up a bit more to tourism. She applied, and the Russians, thinking about the optics of a young British female meeting her perilous end on the way to Russia and the effect that would have on their tourism, I guess, denied her a visa. She threw the letter on the floor and said, "I'll show those bloody Reds," and decided that she was going to go to India as well. So she never set off to ride around the world. She originally was intending to go to Moscow and then thought, well, if they're saying that I can't do it due to the distances involved. And she'd planned out, and bearing in mind, obviously, this is way pre-internet, she'd planned out where all the petrol stations were, and she'd done an incredible amount of research in terms of planning this trip to Moscow. So I think she was pretty fed up with them that they then wouldn't give her a visa. So she was like, well, I'll go to India instead. And then it was, when she got to India, everywhere was just, oh, well, I'll go there as well, and I'll go there as well. She didn't set out to ride around the world, and very nearly didn't. She very nearly didn't do the last leg of it because she'd met her husband by then and decided that she was just going to stay put and not bother with that. And she used to say, I'm not a motorcyclist. And she'd done more riding than a lot of people I know will manage in their lifetimes.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's kind of a theme of her trip, really, because one trip to India and presumably back did actually turn into 9 years on the road. And we'll talk a little bit about how she sustained those 9 years. But that is a constant theme, that she was very reactive in a way. She had kind of a plan, but that was constantly changing and evolving. It took her something like 3 years to get to India in the end.
I used to say to Mary that I think if you had a kind of picture encyclopedia, if you looked up the word formidable, there would just be a picture of Mary. And she was just the most extraordinary person as an older woman. And I can only imagine what she must have been like as a young woman in terms of, that determination to just do stuff and not see things as obstacles.
Patrick, you're probably not as old as me, but you've probably got more experience than I have with vintage motorcycles. The BSA Bantam is a 175 two-stroke motorcycle with very limited levels of comfort, suspension, braking, power, everything. Was that a sensible choice for her to take on a 9-year trip around the world?
I think the police riders that Saul mentioned probably had it right, that there's something that's mechanically very simple. There's not a lot to go wrong on a Bantam. One of the reasons we love having the Bantam on display is it tells so many stories. You may or may not know that the BSA Bantam actually came as part of war reparations after the Second World War. Originally, it was a DKW design, a German design. And after the Second World War, as reparations were being worked out, a number of manufacturers were given a chance to have the DKW, it was a 125cc two-stroke then, and make it in their own image. So BSA took the drawings, completely redrew them from metric to imperial, and then built the bike. And the bike sold in the hundreds of thousands. You talk to a motorcyclist of a certain age in Britain, and they probably started off on a Bantam. The GPO used them as the post office used them for the telegram service, and we've got two earlier Bantams in our collection at the National Motor Museum, one of which is a GPO red one. It's not exactly overflowing with power, but I think a number of modern riders now see the wisdom in going for a smaller, more manageable bike.
She didn't mention having to have the engine rebuilt at all. There was no mention of new pistons or anything like that in the podcast, Martin. Do we know if it was completely reliable or she did have to pull it apart, as you quite often do with two-strokes?
She did say on the podcast that she'd had more speedometers than punctures, because the roads that she was riding on were rattling the instrumentation of the Bantam to bits. I don't think she had any engine breakdowns. She had some welding done, Indonesia or somewhere like that she'd had to get the rack welded up. But by and large, I think the bike did sterling work and got her most of the way without major problems. She fell off in Australia.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Today's exciting episode is brought to you by Adventure Specs Super Shirt 2.0.
2.0?
Yep, it's a new version. It's got the flow armour, which is a lot more breathable, and yet it's still CE AA rated. So it gives you both impact protection and abrasion resistance.
It's an absolute game changer.
It is actually, because you completely forget you've got it on. The armour's really soft. I even find myself checking to see if I've actually remembered to put it on sometimes.
It still feels wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But it's the first thing I put on for all motorcycling activities, basically. I even wore it and you mocked me when we were doing some trials practice.
Thank God you were wearing it that day, because I don't think you'd be with us today if you hadn't been wearing it when you got on the trials bike.
It wasn't that bad. It's even been crash tested on an actual human, which I don't think any other garment has ever been tested that way.
They threw a man down a runway wearing one, didn't they?
It's actually quite scary to watch, but he came away unscathed, which is pretty good news.
What do you wear over the top of yours?
Well, you know I'm a bit of a hipster, so it's usually a check shirt and a very long beard.
Just something to hide the coffee stains?
Yes, the very rare blend espressos that I normally drink.
Nice.
So there are sizes for all, from small to, I think, triple XL. It's quite stretchy as well, so it'll fit women, and it fits fatties like me too. To get your super shirt, head to adventurespec.com.
I was on about the last 30 kilometres of the dirt road going from Perth to Darwin. And I know I was gung-ho. I thought, I've only got 30 kilometres more of this. Oh, this is fantastic. And I was going too fast. And they have what is called bull dust in Australia. And it's like a talcum powder. You have to concentrate on the road. The bull dust is a slightly different colour because it's probably much finer than ordinary dust. And I noticed this at the last minute. And the front wheel went down into the hole, and the front wheel turned round on me, and I went straight on, and I landed on the top of my knee, and I turned round and managed to get back to the bike, switch it off. Petrol was, I think, tipping out of it. So I managed to get the bike up. I didn't really pay much attention to what I'd done to my leg. I think I had to take the mudguard off because that had buckled. So I strapped that on the back. And then I went to a police post. The policeman came out of his house and he'd got a collar on. And he'd fallen down the steps, I think, on Christmas Day. I thought, one beer too many, you silly man. And he wasn't interested in the fact that I've hurt my leg really badly, and I don't know what to do. So I thought, right, forget you. So I went on, and I knew there was going to be a petrol pump somewhere. I got to the petrol pump, and it literally was just a sort of shanty place, run by an old boy and his daughter. I managed, by this stage, I did manage to get off the bicycle myself, but my leg had swollen up so much that the only way they could get my jeans off was by splitting the seam right the way down the side and unwrapping it off my leg. And my leg was the colour of a really beautiful sunset. It was blue and red, and it hurt like hell. Anyway, they gave me some painkillers, and by this stage I could hardly move. It hurt so much. And they laid me on a camp bed, and I was there for 2 or 3 days, if I remember rightly.
And she had to spend some time straightening things out. Mind you, she'd hurt her leg, so I don't think she did those repairs herself. But the bike was great.
What state was it in before it came to the museum, Patrick? It was a sympathetic restoration, I understand.
I think it's what the antique experts would say has a good patina. It's been lived in. It's got the battle scars. Mary told me that I think it was 3 Speedos that she'd replaced. BSA would send them to her, and that's why she couldn't actually tell us what the final mileage was. Just 2 punctures, which I think is remarkable.
Had she kept it, or did you have to find it from somewhere else?
Part of that first telephone conversation with Mary, I obviously said, oh, so what happened to the bike? And she said, oh, I've still got it. And I said, oh my goodness. This is 50 years later, you've still got the bike? And she said, yes. She said, when I brought it back from my trip, I put it in my mum's shed, and there it stayed for decades. It turned out she'd never ridden it again, but it sat in the shed. And then about 10 years previously, she thought, oh, I want to get this sorted out now. I should look into getting it repaired because I would like to ride it again. She wanted to get it sorted out, and so she found a local motorbike shop close to her, and she took her bike there, and the guy said, yep, I can sort that out for you. But actually, 10 years later, it was just in bits still. So I said to Mary, I know someone who's very good at putting motorbikes back together from a box of rusty bits, Craig Carey Clinch. Thus began the Bantam's journey of being resurrected. Craig enlisted the help of Max Jowett, and the two of them got to work on Mary's Bantam. They were absolutely dismayed by the state it was in. They feel that when the bike was taken apart, there was more damage done then than it would have been if left whole. And so they had quite a task ahead of them. And ahead of them was the Overland event, because they had just a few months till that was happening. And I said, oh, it'd be really good if we've got Mary at the event and we've got her bike there.
There was this kind of relay, hopped across the country till it got down to Craig's. He and Max took a look and decided that Craig would take care of the kind of the mechanicals and Max would look after all the tin work. He took to trying to work out how he could restore it without losing all of the fabulous kind of stickers and stuff which Mary had, but working around all the rust that had sort of started, the surface rust that had started to set in. Then Craig started to look at the bits that were in the boxes, and it looked as if sort of like the piston had been removed with the claw hammer. It was not good. Swarf in the gearbox and this, that and the other, because it hadn't had a rebuild on the trip. It had done the whole trip without an engine rebuild. They got the bike, I think it was the end of May, and the brief was it needs to be ideally up and running so that Mary can ride it by the end of August, beginning of September, because Mary had visions at that point of actually riding it to Overland, which we managed to dissuade her from because it didn't seem like a brilliant idea having someone on a bike which had just been rebuilt, who hadn't ridden at all for 50 years, out on the public roads as their first bit of riding. They managed to get it restored and running. Various bits had to be sourced. I think a couple of parts actually had to be custom made for it. The tank had to be replaced sort of very sympathetically with another one, so it still looks as if it's the original tank, but it is actually a replacement. But apart from that, it's largely original. All of the tin work Max managed to salvage using his secret ingredient. That they managed to get it there on the day and running, and Mary rode it for the first time in 50 years. And there's a couple of little bits of video of Mary riding the bike with various hardened overlanders standing around, and it's like watching a load of parents with a child setting off on their bike without stabilizers for the first time. It was a lovely moment.
Patrick Collins from the National Motor Museum at Bewley explains a little bit more about how they came to have Mary's Bantam in their collection.
Mary loaned it to us initially. We had a lovely day when she came to the museum with the family to sort of do some photographs of the handover and that sort of thing and the loan. And we had a bit of a laugh when she couldn't get her leg over the bike. And she said, "Oh, get hold of my leg, Patrick, and help me on." I said, "Madam, I couldn't possibly." But she had a lovely day. She's walking around. I do remember one lady was looking at her bike with her husband, and she sort of nudged her husband. She said, "Gosh," she says, "you should read this. It's amazing." And I tapped her on the shoulder and I said, "The lady standing behind you." And 20 minutes later, she was still nattering and telling them more and more stories. When we got the sad news, Caroline, stepdaughter, rang me. I choked up, and I will probably choke up now telling the story. But when she told me what was happening with Mary, and she said she's really concerned that the bike stays with you. She'd like to donate it to the museum. So she did actually bequeath it to us in her will. So that is now part of the permanent collection of the National Motor Museum Trust. It was on display next to two other round-the-world bikes. We had Steph Jevons's Honda TRF 250L Ronda to Honda on loan to us for 6 years until this year's Overland event. So it sat there next to Ronda to Honda and Pat and Ness Garrett's R100 GS The Bear, which they rode round the world. So we had 3 round-the-world bikes, but Mary's little bike will sit there in perpetuity. Some lovely friends of hers down in Gosport, the Gosport Bike Social crowd, came soon after she passed and placed a wreath next to the bike as well. We'll continue to tell the story. When the museum is about telling stories, and it's not just about nuts and bolts and capacities and valve clearances, it's about the human stories as well, and that's a wonderful human story that we tell. And Martin did us a special cut of his film as well, which we have used once, and my intention is when we refurbish the museum, there'll be a screen next to the bike, and so Mary will be there with her bike telling people a story and continuing to inspire and entertain us all.
It's probably worth talking a little bit about the geography of her trip, because it wasn't a straightforward round-the-world trip, was it? At one point, she's in Kabul and she ends up driving a car back to the UK and then picking another car up in France and driving back.
I suppose I must have said it would be nice to go back because I'd been out of England for 3 years. I was offered a Land Rover by an American who was going to relocate from America to the land of his forefathers, Ireland. And he wanted the Land Rover delivered to Dublin. In the end, we had it all fitted up. He had a whole lot of boxes of books that he wanted. He worked for the university in Kabul. He had a bad back, so he didn't want to drive back overland. His wife certainly didn't, and they'd got children as well. So I guess I just arrived at the right time. We fitted up a board on top of all the boxes, and I had a mattress and my sleeping bag because I was going to sleep in the vehicle for security. And I was allowed some space, so I have got 2 tin trunks in a cupboard here in my flat, which I brought back from Afghanistan with all sorts of things that I wanted to safeguard and not to send home by post or anything like that. When people in the foreign community found out that I was going to be in Europe, I was offered 3 cars to bring back to Afghanistan because foreigners were allowed to import a car duty-free. I was offered a Mercedes by a German. There was a Swedish man who worked for the United Nations. He had ordered a brand new Peugeot 504 from the factory in France, and you couldn't buy it. You had to be on a waiting list. And in the end, I said, yes, okay, I'd go and collect that. So I got back to England and met up with all my family. And then I went over to France and picked up the car and did all the paperwork, took it back to England. And of course, there I was, arriving in my village in Sussex in this brand new Peugeot 504 saloon car, when everybody thought that I was supposed to be in Afghanistan on a motorcycle.
It's quite a trip, isn't it, over the 9 years?
It is. This is where Mary and I discovered we had so many parallels, because my own first journey was, I'm going to ride a motorbike to India, and equally zero experience of motorbikes, etc. When Mary reached India, she realised, I've had so much fun, I don't want to stop. And as you said, she spent some time in Afghanistan and She would say, "Oh, Tiffany, when I was there, Afghanistan was all miniskirts and cocktails." And she had a wonderful 2 years working there during that time.
I entered into the social life in Afghanistan, and because my boss was a bachelor, he would be invited to 2 or 3 things a night. You had to find your own entertainment. It was very difficult to even get BBC World Service because it was just so difficult there. So he would be invited to a cocktail party, a buffet dinner, and to a sit-down dinner. And I would have to try and arrange that he could go to all 3. And if it was a sit-down dinner, very often I would be invited because they wanted to marry up the couples. Apart from which, everybody in the community, and this really would have been Americans, everybody in the community wanted to see who was this English girl who'd arrived on a motorbike who was working for the Asia Foundation. It was really, really nice. I couldn't drink because I had to drive my boss. I had to go and pick my boss up, take him to the party and then drive him back, which meant we didn't have to have a driver from the office. At weekends, I was allowed to use any of the vehicles. There was a gang of us, of single people, and I used to fill the Land Rover with all my friends, and off we would go. I had a fantastic life. I really did. It was out of this world.
She then had continued and had reached India, travelled around, and then realised, actually, there is a bit of a dead end there, because in those days, you couldn't go on any further through Myanmar, or Burma as it was known then. I'd had the same situation, and so it's like, right, we've reached India. Okay, I'll find someone to ship it. Oh, I fancy going to Africa. I think, Martin, you might know a bit more about why she decided to zigzag back to Africa, unless that was just the cheapest place. She was on the west coast of India. She went to Mumbai and shipped it across to Kenya on Africa's east coast.
I think the decision to go to Africa, I think it just came to her. She'd reached India, she'd done what she set out to do, and her feeling was, well, why stop? Why not just carry on? And so she investigated shipping the bike to Africa, which turned out to be not that difficult, and continued to ride down through Africa. And again, didn't really think much more of it than that. It was just, well, we'll go somewhere else now. I'm not going to stop because I've kind of got the bug.
At the point at which she left the country, there were restrictions on how much currency you could take. So part of the reason that the journey was kind of a bit haphazard was that the point at which she left the country, she was only allowed to take £80 with her. And there were different amounts depending on whether you were taking a motorbike or a car. And it was something like there was £15 for the motorbike and there was £15 for something else. And it added up to the total that she was allowed was £80. She stopped in Istanbul for 6 months and worked there. And then when she got to Kabul, she actually stopped there and worked there for 2 years. So she'd built up a bit of kind of travelling nest egg while she was enjoying herself in Kabul. Mary's approach was very much, well, I've got the money to go and do that. It seems like an interesting thing. I'll do that.
I'd like to talk a little bit how she was received and treated while she was travelling, because she had both good and some not so great experiences, which she seemed to cope with very admirably. There was one story where she's only reached Paris at this point and her luggage falls off whilst riding around the Arc de Triomphe, and she got some great help there.
And I went round trying to find how to get up this little lane off the Arc de Triomphe, but it was one way only. All the luggage fell off because the luggage was tied on with octopus straps and they were elasticated, and the whole luggage just swung on the cobblestones, and the whole lot cascaded down onto the road round the Arc de Triomphe. And a gendarme appeared, screamed at me, obviously thought I was a young man, and told me to pick up all the luggage and get it back on the bike. So I sat there. I think I did cry. And then I picked it all up and I put it on the bike and hoped to God it was going to stay on. And then when he wasn't looking, I shot up this little side street that I needed, but in the wrong direction.
And also, I think in early weeks and months of her travelling, she possibly wasn't quite sure it was the right thing to be doing, because she ended up meeting up with a group of people, and I think some young Dutch folk encouraged her to carry on, didn't they?
She was staying in youth hostels, met backpackers, although they weren't called that in those days, and teamed up with some of them and ended up travelling through Italy. And that gave her the confidence, yes, wherever I'm travelling, I'm able to make friends and I'll just keep going. So with the encouragement of the other travellers she'd met, she did just keep on going, heading eastward towards India.
I was saying how depressed I was about the whole thing, and I didn't know what I was doing, and honest to God, I really, really wanted to pack it in, and they said no. Obviously, it's difficult. There isn't anybody else on a motorcycle. There isn't a female on a motorcycle on her own. It's not going to be easy. You can't expect it to be easy because you're doing something that's very, very different. So persevere. And if you don't want the motorbike, we'll buy it off you. And I said, you're not buying my motorbike.
But certainly there was, for her, some loneliness, because it is a really solitary thing to do, is to undertake a long distance solo motorbike ride. And Mary was finding out mile by mile all the different aspects that affect you, from the loneliness, the how do I cope with things, but also the sheer joy and the selfishness you have from doing solo travel, because you can go exactly where you want, when you want, and not have to take anyone else into consideration. And I think that took a little while, but she very soon came to relish that.
I think it was a couple of Dutch boys that she met towards the end of the Europe leg. And one of them tried to buy her motorcycle off her, and she indignantly refused his offer. And I think that gave her another boost, if you like, and it fed her, I'll show him. He doesn't think I can do this on my own. He wants to buy my motorbike. I'm not selling him my bloody motorbike. I can carry on and I can show the world I'm capable of doing this. And that was very much part of her character makeup, I think.
I think one of the most interesting periods, certainly that came out of Martin's podcast about Mary Motorcycle, was the time she actually spent in Kabul. Now, she was very lucky that she was able to work her way around the world, relying on the skills that she'd developed in the UK. And as an English speaker, she was able to go to various places throughout the globe and find work that suited her. Kabul, for example, where she spent 2 years, was a really different place to what it is now.
I saw Afghanistan as it once was, which very, very few people, because it was 50 years ago, very, very few people know what it was like. Before the Taliban, before the Russians moved in, there was a royal family. And in fact, I was given the royal command to go and give English lessons to one of the princesses. It just made me roar with laughter. I thought, honest to God, I arrived out here as an English girl on a motorcycle, and here I am going into the palace to give English lessons to one of the princesses. That obviously was quite an experience.
She integrated into the expat community, people doing government jobs, working in industry and probably the oil industry out there then. And she told about a time that the people that were working out there at the same time as her, they were often leaving the country and going back home to England. And so she saw several rotations of personnel out there that she was serving alongside, so that when she finally decided to continue her journey, she said, oh, well, I'm just going to carry on my motorbike trip now. And everybody who she'd made friends with, they didn't know what she was talking about because she'd been there so long. She'd never really mentioned the fact that she had this motorcycle in a shed up the street somewhere, and she was going to carry on and ride to India on this thing that they didn't even know existed. She didn't really talk about the journey much, even while she was integrating into Kabul society. It was amazing, really.
This is not only before the Russians went into Afghanistan, this is before the communist government had taken over. So Afghanistan still had a royal family. And one day she was working at this American NGO, and a guy from the palace turned up and said, I understand you have a well-spoken English woman working here. And they said, oh, yes, that'll be Mary. And he said, she is to come to the palace to teach the princess English. And it wasn't a, would she mind awfully? It was a, that's what you're doing. It was very much a, sort of literally by royal command. And so after that, Mary ended up having to make a trip up to the palace sort of once a week or whatever to teach the princess English. To Mary, it's just another one of those things. We'd had a number of phone calls, and she'd definitely done the first Overland presentation before she just slipped into conversation that this was one of the things she'd done.
I was thinking about this today, and maybe this is a question for Tiffany. I couldn't quite decide whether the world was a bigger or a smaller place, because so many opportunities seemed to come her way. Now, did those opportunities come her way, or was it just the force of her personality that led to all these amazing things she got to do?
I think she had such a zest for life and an interest in what was happening around her and people she was meeting, that her natural charisma drew people to her. She was extremely hardworking. She had amazing secretarial skills. The jobs she managed to pick up on her travels and the friends she made on her travels were just incredible. And she kept all those connections up. And I think, like you say, she created those opportunities, but not through deliberately trying. It was accidental or incidental things that happened, and she took full advantage of them. She would just be open to anything. She'd think, okay, yeah, let's give that a try.
And she was incredibly bold as well, wasn't she? Because she was told in a number of occasions she decided she wanted to go into Uganda. And Idi Amin had just taken power, and obviously all manner of terrible things happened during his reign. Her attitude was, oh no, I'll be okay.
By the time I got to Uganda, President Amin had booted out Obote. Amin had been in power for about a month or so, and people in Kenya were saying, for God's sake, don't go to Uganda. You're white, he's chucking everybody, all foreigners out, and you'll be shot probably. And being a female on your own, goodness knows what could happen to you. And I said, oh, no, I don't think things like that really happen. I had great trust in human beings, and I hadn't had any problems, really.
She was the absolute epitome of formidable. And I would add feisty as well. And there's that confidence that you build in yourself and the resilience when you're travelling as well, that, okay, I'll give this a try. And you also build up that thick skin where you will come across people who will say, oh, why are you doing that for? You can't do that. And you just think, do you know what? I'm going to do it, and I'm doing it my way. And Mary absolutely did it her way.
I think she had a gift for understatement as well. There was a period of the journey where she was travelling up the Mekong. She was heading up towards Vietnam, and she referred to what was happening in Vietnam at the time, which was pretty serious, as one or two little skirmishes, and she might be better advised not to travel up there on a motorcycle. In fact, it was, America was bombing the hell out of the place, and it really wasn't a place for anybody to be that didn't have to be. But she just saw it as a minor inconvenience that had to be ridden around or get out quick before it all kicks off, I think she said.
She wasn't kind of foolhardy. She was kind of aware of times there were risks. She wasn't kind of blasé about it, but she wasn't easily deterred. There were times when, particularly with people rather than places, there were people who, if she thought they were a little bit suspect, she'd be a bit wary of them and think, I think I'll move on from here. But in terms of Mary doing something, I think the best way of getting Mary to do something was to tell her that she shouldn't do it. If you told her that she couldn't do it, or it would be unwise for her to do it, that was like an invitation for Mary to go, well, you might think that, but you're not me. There's one lovely story, and again, I can't remember which place it was, but there was somewhere where the guy on the border was saying, well, if you were a daughter of mine, I wouldn't let you go. And she said, well, as far as I know, you're not my father. I appreciate the advice, but actually, no, I'm going to go and do it. And that was just very Mary.
I was told by certainly all the white people I met, you can't go through the Transkei on your own on a motorbike. It's not safe. So I said, oh, that's what they said about Africa. Oh, for God's sakes, what are they going to do? I'm on a motorbike. I'm not harming anybody. I haven't got any money. Why would they harm me? They'll harm somebody who's harmed them. I said, people don't go out of their way to harm anybody. Well, not in those days anyway. So off I trotted across the Transkei. And of course, I had no problems whatsoever.
When she set off, the equipment she had was, it's difficult enough to get motorcycling gear for women now, but she certainly couldn't find leathers to fit a woman back then. I believe she set off with a tent, and she was wearing a Helly Hansen sailing outfit, which actually she found quite valuable in the end, I think.
Patrick, do you have that in the museum?
The jacket had disappeared. Caroline, her stepdaughter, after the bike came to us, in fact, after Mary passed, she said, "Is the jacket in the panniers? Because there's various things still left over from the travels and a few parts from the restoration in the panniers." And I said, "No." I said, we've taken all the contents of the panniers out. They're all in store. There's the trousers of the Helly Hansen sailing suit, but not the jackets. Which is a great shame, because a number of those pictures of her slides you see where she's wearing this blue Helly Hansen sailing jacket, it's so obviously sailing kit and not motorcycle kit.
I couldn't afford leathers. I don't even know whether they made leathers in those days for women. I would have had to have a man's. At 6 foot tall, the man's would have been much broader than me, and I hadn't got any money. I don't know how I did, but I bought a Helly Hansen sailing outfit, which took me around the world. It proved to be accident-proof because I went across the road quite a few times on my shoulders, and there's not a scratch on the top. The trousers have got quite torn at the knees where I've fallen, but they've been sewn up quite a few times.
She still had it, so the footage of her riding the bike for the first time at Overland is her in the same blue Helly Hansen sailing jacket that she'd been around the world in. I had a conversation with the family at the wake. A look of horror dawned on various faces when I started talking about this jacket, and we think it might have gone in with a whole load of clothing that ended up going to the charity shop.
What I found quite interesting was that whilst it took you guys to kind of discover Mary's story, at the time, she was actually quite famous. Her story and her exploits sort of followed her around the world, didn't they? There was people sort of waiting for her to arrive in various towns and make her welcome. Lots of newspaper, lots of radio stories, some more positive stories than others.
I left west of Istanbul and I went down to what we would call Gallipoli, the Dardanelles. On the ferry going across, I met a father and son. And father was very senior in the army. He had got gold braid all over himself in his uniform. And I think the son was in the army too. And they were going to stay in a motel. And they knew who I was. So they said, "Will you please come and stay with us?" So I said, "Thank you very much, but I don't accept hospitality." No. Perfectly okay, I'll find myself a little guest house. No. You're a guest in our country, no, please. So they put me up in a room, separate room, in the motel. But the only trouble was, most of the night I was kept awake by either father trying to get through the door or the son trying to get through the door. And I was not abused. They tried the window, they tried absolutely everything. I don't think they ever tried it at the same time. Whether they'd worked it out that one was stirring at one time and one was, I really don't know. When it came to breakfast, I behaved as though nothing had happened. So I had breakfast and then I bid them a farewell and off I trotted. And as I say, I went round all down the west coast of Turkey, halfway along the south coast, with people waving at me.
The media took great interest in her travels. I know throughout Africa, the local newspapers picked up on this lone English woman riding a motorcycle through their country. And that continued all the way to Australia, where the media interest it got serious there because she was interviewed on television and she also wrote articles for local newspapers and things like that. So she learned to live with the publicity, but also I think she benefited from it in some instances because I know for a fact she got a ship to New Zealand from Australia. And I think she got a good upgrade in the cabin because of the publicity that had been following her around Australia.
I wrote a 2-page spread in a Sunday newspaper in Sydney, and the shipping company obviously saw this, and I mentioned that I was sailing on this particular ship to go to New Zealand. And I said, I guess if they've got a cabin spare. And I gave them the publicity, but what it counts for, I really don't know. But I said, no, I got upgraded. I said, I didn't know anything about it until I arrived down at the port, and they took my motorbike, and my motorbike's sitting in a room somewhere. And I think the managing director was down there who was seeing me out of Australia, which was really, really nice. I can't get over it. But I said, that's the sort of thing that has happened to me on many occasions when I have been around the world on this tour. And he said, I don't know how you're going to take this, but when you arrive on the quay, there are some newspaper people there. They want to interview you, and TV cameras.
She came to recognised the importance and the value of having newspaper coverage and TV and radio coverage more later in the journey, and enjoyed it, I think.
I was told I had to get to the railway crossing, but there wasn't a railway. And there was this huge wooden building, which was the local post office convenience store. So I trundled down on my little BSA Bantam and parked the bike, and out comes this big woman. I don't think she had rollers in her hair, but she's the sort of woman who would have done. She stood at the top of the steps and she said, "Well, it's about time you arrived, isn't it?" in a strong Cockney accent. And she came from the East End of London. Oh, she was so nice. And she ran the post office convenience store. And she had been reading all the postcards I'd been sending to Mr. and Mrs. Rutter, who I was going to stay with on a farm. So she knew all about my travels.
When she was in Turkey, she was in 2 national newspapers, which meant that when she then fell off her bike and was sat in the road, kind of tapping around trying to find her glasses, which at that point she was kind of lost without, these trucks full of men stopped. And because she'd been living with a Turkish family, she'd picked up some of the language, and she could hear them saying, "Well, you know who that is, don't you? That's that English girl that's going around the world in a motorbike." There were kind of definite advantages to her getting herself known. And actually, it was the motorcycle press here who kind of pretty much ignored her at the time when she tried to get some coverage when she'd first finished the trip. And she was very scathing about one of the National Motorcycle Press publications, which had been a bit sniffy at the time. And after she died, they asked if they were going to do a big obituary piece on a sort of double-page spread thing. And they said, "But we need some more photos." So I said, "Well, I can put you in touch with the family." The executives of her estate had a discussion between them and said, "No, we don't think Mary would want that publication to have the photos because they weren't interested in it when she first finished doing it, and so they can't have anything now." Which on the one hand was a real shame because it meant that the piece never ran, and on the other hand it's just that force of nature that was Mary kind of reaching back, her views being respected from beyond the grave kind of thing. So very fitting. A shame that she didn't get more recognition when she'd first finished, because I think maybe that affected her view of the trip and thinking, "Oh, well, it was just something I did, it wasn't a big deal." And maybe if the press here had made more of what she'd done at the time, maybe she would have realised earlier that actually it was a big deal.
I think it's sometimes a lack of imagination on the side of some of the journals and newspapers, because they just can't always picture the impact a story like that might have, which seems totally ridiculous and crazy. It was another parallel with my story that when I was talking to Mary, she said, "Oh, yes, when I got back, my mum wrote to the Daily Telegraph and they published a few paragraphs about me." And I said, "Oh, my goodness, that's exactly what my mum did." And my mum is not one to write to the papers at all. But she said, "Oh, Tiffany, now that you've been around the world, I'm going to write to the Telegraph." And sure enough, she wrote to them and they published a few paragraphs about my story. And then, boom, that's it. It dies a death. Not that we would have these stories published for the recognition or anything, but certainly I think Mary and I were very similar in the let's let people know that it's not rocket science. Anybody can get up and just do it. And also it's not just the men successfully doing these journeys. It's perfectly capable for women to do them as well. And in fact, Mary and I both agreed that we think women make better travellers than men.
Women make better lots of things than men. It's interesting. We have lots and lots of information about what it's like to ride around the world. And there's actually quite a few people doing it, or certainly doing big overland trips, not necessarily around the world, but certainly there's quite a few people doing big overland trips. We've got a lot of insight into what the landscape is like and what the mechanical problems are like. We don't necessarily get as much insight into what happens inside the helmet and inside the person's head while they're doing it. But the mechanics of what the roads are like and all that sort of stuff, we get loads of information about that. So we have an appreciation of it, but we're also bombarded with lots of people doing big trips. Back then, there weren't lots of people doing big trips, but equally, I think there was that thing of people who were just in the UK and living their relatively straightforward lives in the UK didn't necessarily appreciate actually quite what it was like. They didn't appreciate quite what the roads in Africa were like, or quite how big Australia is and how big the distances were between. They just think, oh yes, I've got a cousin who moved to Australia and they live in Sydney, whereas not realizing actually what the Nullarbor Plain is like and what the roads were like and what the opportunities for dying of dehydration were through just something as simple as the bike breaking down. We've gone from very few people doing it and very little understanding of what it's like through to a lot of understanding and appreciation, therefore, of what it's like. It's kind of tipping point across the decades, I guess.
Without dissing or naming and shaming any particular motorcycle publication, I spend quite a lot of my working life and quite a lot of my spare time in old magazines and old motoring and old motorcycle magazines. When I look at the motoring press of the 60s and 70s, actually it's very much a traditional, here's a road test, here's a report from the Isle of Man TT, here's a report from the Grand Prix. And actually there's rather less in the way of the travelogue and the stories of travel and that sort of thing. In their defence, and I think they were mad to not cover a story, the magazines of the day probably far more traditional in the way they covered reporting motorcycle news. It was about new models, it was about motorsport and what's coming next year and accessories and things, and rather less about actually getting out and riding motorcycles, I think.
Kind of mechanical interest rather than personal interest, very much, wasn't it?
Sprockets and bollocks, as we call it. Stolen that from your ex-wife. So here's a question. Thinking about the way she travelled, which was obviously pretty rudimentary back then. She was staying in youth hostels. She was staying with friends. She spent 9 years on the road working where she could, getting quite good and well-paid jobs, spending quite a bit of time in places. Is it still possible to do that now?
I think so, yes, very much so. In some respects, it's a lot easier now because you can set things up in advance with the internet. Some people seem more open to overseas people, whereas others feel more fear because so much of the media covers negative stories, because that is the headlines people want to see, it seems, anyway, that they get drawn to. That is the clickbait, when things go wrong rather than things going right. But I do believe that anybody could set off and do exactly what Mary did, which was just make your way around the world, sort of bumbling along, 6 months work in Istanbul, then 2 years work in Afghanistan, but sort of just playing it by ear, taking those opportunities when you see them, and sometimes taking a risk, which, when you think about it, around the world motorbike journey is a big risk in itself. And if you're open to taking risks, then you're open to opportunities as well.
There's also that thing of there's the opportunity to set things up in advance. You can look online and you can find a job that's going to be going in the next place you're going. There are some jobs which you can do from the road. Simon Thomas has spent years designing people's logos and doing a bit of marketing stuff and a bit of graphic design. And if you've got a laptop and an internet connection, there's a huge number of jobs that you can now do from anywhere, as well as using the internet to find the jobs in advance. What I think has probably become a bit more difficult is the amount of regulation around working. So, Mary was 6 months in Istanbul working without a work permit, and that kind of stuff has undoubtedly become a bit more difficult in a lot of countries now. It's become easier in some ways, more difficult in others.
Did Mary ever talk about how the 9 years on the road changed her?
I think it was one of the only 4 questions that I asked her in producing 3 hours of tape. I don't think she actually answered it. She seemed to want to tell her story. I explored a little bit about who she was before she set off. And my intention with that was to then compare it to who she was when she returned and sort of look at any changes and any differences in her character. And we got to about 2 hours, 45 minutes. And I was pretty tired, actually, but she was still talking like a good one. I realised that I hadn't got very much on the bike. And so in a bit of a panic, I swung the questioning around towards the BSA Bantam, and we started talking about speedometers and punctures and things falling off and things like that. By the time I came back round to saying, so how had it changed you? She went off into her closing little monologue, which wasn't an answer to my question either. So I'm not sure if that journey did change Mary. And I think that speaks to her strength of character. I think the Mary that came back was pretty similar to the Mary that set off. She just had a whole load more stories to tell. And her closing monologue was about what we've just been talking about, the difference between traveling then on a little Bantam with some lashed on luggage with elasticated straps and things, to people flying drones over their bikes and things like that, which modern overlanders can do. And she made the point of how the journey is different today and maybe not quite as good. So she saw a world that doesn't exist anymore. And I think she had a little bit of sympathy for modern overlanders who go with all the digital kit and stuff like that, because she feels like they're not experiencing it the way she experienced it. They weren't stopping to ask for directions, for example, because they've got it on the sat nav. And she feels like modern overlanders maybe miss out on some of the experiences that she had. But in answer to your question, which you asked a long time ago, I don't think it changed her very much at all.
Anybody who did something like that would say it built up their self-confidence. I probably had more self-confidence than the average person because of having lived, I went off and lived in Jersey for 3 years. I went to Israel for 9 months, not really knowing where I was going, other than I was going to find out what life was like on a kibbutz. Obviously, it built up more self-confidence. I'm certainly not scared of saying boo to a goose. We were brought up, because my father died when I was 11 and a half, we were brought up by a mother who had no money. She was quite a disciplinarian, and we were never allowed to argue back. You sit there, and I'm going to talk to you, and you do not answer back. And it wasn't until I was working in an office in Jersey, in a lawyer's office, and there was a young girl who came to work there. Her hours were 9 to 5. One of the partners used to keep her there until 6. So the next morning, because he hadn't signed his letters, so she had to take them to the post office. So the next morning, instead of coming in at 9, because she'd been kept an hour later, the night before, she came in at 10. My boss, who was supposed to be in charge of staff, wasn't very happy about this. And I thought, oh, I think she's right. I don't know that I would do it, because I wouldn't. But I think she's right. No, I'm on her side. So I explained that to my boss. Oh, probably because I was a good secretary, I wasn't fired. And she taught me that if you didn't stand up for yourself, nobody else was going to.
I would say with Mary, she set off as a very formidable, that word comes up again, a very formidable person. And she came back, that same formidable person, with even more confidence in herself as a person and with that resilience you develop from the road. I think the main thing you get from doing an extended trip, especially a solo one, whatever form of transport you use, is you end up being a more assertive person and with more confidence in yourself, because you've had to deal with the most unlikely of situations on your travels. You develop this belief that, yeah, I can deal with this. I can deal with anything. I won't worry about the things ahead of time. I'll just get on and deal with them when they happen.
How did Mary enjoy all this recognition 50 years after she did the journey? How did she enjoy the overland event? Did she enjoy the company of fellow travellers?
Initially, she was a little bit kind of wary of the whole thing. My first phone call with Mary was, I had a very excited Tiff phoning up, having been on the phone to Mary, and she said, Saul, you have to speak to this woman. She's incredible. Tiff's enthusiasm kind of really came over, and I kind of got told the story of all this stuff that she'd done, and she said, you have to get her to overland because it'd just be amazing. This was the middle of 2021, and of course it was still the pandemic and lockdowns. She was a little bit wary about the idea of going to this event that had hundreds and hundreds of people, and was a little bit bemused by the fact that all these people would be interested in hearing her story, because it was something that she didn't really talk about, because it wasn't something that people were really interested in. So the idea that there was this whole community of people who would be hanging on her every word. So there was a degree of persuasion involved in kind of saying, no, you really should. I think you'll like it, and come along. And so she did it, and she headlined the 2021 event and received just such a spontaneous standing ovation and so much love from everyone. Made a lot of friends who she stayed in regular contact with after that, and just loved the whole seen and thought it was extraordinary. You know, all of the advances in technology and the way that people were recording their stories and the amount of interest there was in their stories, and all that was just a kind of revelation to her, because she hadn't gone anywhere near motorcycles, let alone overland motorcycles, in the 50 years since she'd finished. But as Mary used to say when people said, "Oh, you're going to write a book," and she'd say, "Well, I will, you know, at some point. Actually, you know, I already had a very full life before I was discovered, and I don't know why people say that I was discovered, because I knew where I was and I knew what I'd done." She loved it, and she did thrive on it, and she loved... There was part of her that was very, "Oh no, don't make a fuss," and then there was part of her that absolutely loved you making a fuss. She did the 2021 event and the 2022 event, and wasn't going to come back in 2023. She said, "I think I'm going to have a year off, and I'm going to." She was going to New Zealand for a big BSA event down there as kind of guest of honour. Probably the March, I think, of that year, February, March, I got another phone call from Tiff. So yeah, two of the best and worst phone calls in my life really were Tiff ringing up all enthusiastic, introducing me to Mary, and Tiff having to ring up really upset because she just got the news that we knew that Mary was having a couple of health issues, but that it was a brain tumour which was very aggressive and they weren't going to be able to do anything with. And Mary set herself a couple of things she wanted to do. There were some friends that she wanted to go out for lunch with, and she wanted to manage to get to the Overland event and to her birthday, which was 2-3 weeks after the event. So she did manage to get to the event that year. She had lunch and had lots and lots of catch-up chats and lots of hugs. It was fabulous. There was nowhere else that she would have rather been that weekend than at Overland, and the fact that she'd managed to get there at all again is a sign of Mary's strength of character and determination, really. She made it to Overland, and then she made it to her birthday, and then died fairly shortly after that.
As far as I'm concerned, it was a brilliant experience. Not what I expected, because I wasn't going to go round the world. I wasn't even really going to India. Well, I was going to Russia. And I never got to Russia. Well, not on the motorbike anyway. Nowadays, yeah, it's a whole different ballgame now. Totally different. And I don't know, it's difficult to know. Adventure is in the mind. If you think you're doing an adventure, you're doing an adventure. I don't regret, as Edith Piaf sang, "Je regrette rien."
Told you, didn't I? Remarkable story and a remarkable woman. The team asked me to pass on a message to everybody to say that if you'd like to organise a viewing and a hosting of the film at, for example, a TRF club night or any other kind of gathering, they're more than happy to provide that viewing, and you get the opportunity to ask questions of one or more members of the team. There is a fee, but that fee will go in its entirety to Mary's chosen charity, Scotty's Little Soldiers, a charity that supports bereaved armed forces children. Either get in touch directly or drop me a note and I'll put you in touch. And finally, I just want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Tiff, Saul, Patrick and Martin for telling Mary's story on the Trail and Adventure Motorbike podcast. Don't forget, search out Motorcycle Mary on Vimeo and any podcasting platform if you want to get more information about her story. It's fantastic stuff. You really should. Right, that's it for this week. See you next time. Thanks for listening. We really do appreciate it. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and if you really appreciate what we do, please consider supporting us on either Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Links are available on our website, tampodcast.com, where you can also go to our store, that's a shop in English, and buy some branded stuff. Please keep listening and, more importantly, spreading the word. Right, that's it. Just a final word from one of our sponsors, and we'll see you next time. you heading out on an adventure? Whether you're tackling the Tet or hitting the green lanes, don't forget to pack the Pits and Bits Towel Off Body and Hair Wash range. It's the ultimate waterless wash. Just pour it on, rub it into a foam and towel it off. That's it. No water, no rinsing, no fuss. It's lightweight, smells amazing, and most importantly, it gets rid of mud, sweat and odours fast. Perfect for when you're off the beaten track. Stay fresh, go further and do it all sustainably. Grab yours now at pitsandbits.co.uk and don't forget to use the code TAMP at checkout for a massive 20% off.